Dan sat across from me, rubbing his palms together as if trying to scrub off an invisible stain. His jaw was tense, eyes darting around the room, unable to settle. I waited, giving him space to speak first. A deep sigh. I'm ashamed of that night. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but thick with regret. I leaned forward slightly. Tell me more. I don't even know how it happened. We were just talking, laughing, even. It was a normal night at the bar. And then, in the blink of an eye, it all went south. One moment, I'm joking around about the game, and the next, I feel like I need to prove something. Like I need to fight for my team. But it wasn't just about the team, you know. It was about me. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. I met this guy, Mike. New in town. We hit it off right away, both huge football fans. It was one of those conversations that flow effortlessly, like we'd known each other for years. We were talking about last week's game, agreeing on most things, hyping each other up, and then he called our defender overrated. Just an opinion, right? But something inside me snapped. I studied his face. Did it feel personal? Dan let out a bitter chuckle. Yeah. Stupid, huh? But in that moment, it wasn't just about football. It felt like he was insulting something I believed in, something that was part of me. Like he was questioning my judgment, my loyalty. I know how crazy that sounds. I shook my head. It doesn't sound crazy. It sounds human. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if those words gave him permission to breathe. The room got louder. Or maybe it was just in my head. People around us started noticing. Some laughed. Some just watched. And I could feel this heat inside me. I wanted to shut him down, make him regret opening his mouth. My fists clenched under the table. I was ready. His fingers tightened around the fabric of his jeans, mimicking the tension of that moment. But then, out of nowhere, this thought hit me: what the hell am I doing? This isn't who I am. I love football, sure, but do I really want to ruin a night, maybe even hurt someone, over a game? Over a difference of opinion? His gaze met mine, searching. I don't know what changed in that second, but instead of throwing words, or worse, fists, I just stopped. I forced myself to unclench my hands, took a deep breath, and said, "Let's drink to our team anyway." And just like that, the tension broke. Mike hesitated, then laughed, raised his glass, and we moved on. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like a battle in my head. I nodded. It was a battle. But you won. Dan let that sink in, eyes flickering with something close to relief. I guess I did. A pause. Then, softer. But why did I get so angry in the first place? That was the real question. And we were only just beginning to find the answer. Dan sat back, exhaling slowly, as if replaying the moment in his head. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee, the silence between us stretching just enough to let the weight of his last words settle. I waited. He needed space to piece it together. You asked if it felt personal, he finally muttered. I guess that's the weirdest part. It did. And I don't know why. I tilted my head slightly, encouraging him to continue. It wasn't just about the defender or the team. It wasn't even about Mike. I mean, he's just some guy I met at a bar. But in that moment, the way he dismissed my opinion, no, the way he dismissed my team, it felt like he was saying I was wrong. That I didn't know what I was talking about. And suddenly, I had to prove something. His knee bounced, a restless energy spilling over. I've always been like that, you know. If someone questions me, even over something small, I feel this pressure inside. Like I have to defend myself, like backing down means I'm weak. I leaned forward slightly. Where do you think that comes from? Dan let out a small, humorless laugh. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, my dad was a tough guy. Not in the way that he hit me or anything, but he didn't really do emotions. He was one of those, man up, don't complain, types. When we watched games together, he'd get so worked up. Screaming at the TV, throwing his hands up, like the players could actually hear him. And God help you if you disagreed with him about a play. He'd shut you down so fast, like your opinion didn't even matter. His voice tightened. I guess I learned pretty early that being right meant being respected. That if you back down, you lose. And if you lose, people stop taking you seriously. He blinked, as if surprising himself with the words. Damn. That sounds messed up, doesn't it? I shook my head. It sounds like something that makes a lot of sense, given where you came from. But let me ask you this, when you were a kid, did you ever feel like your dad did respect your opinions? Dan's jaw tightened. His gaze dropped to the floor. I don't know, he murmured. Probably not. A pause. Okay. No. He didn't. His hands balled into loose fists on his lap. He'd roll his eyes, cut me off mid-sentence. Sometimes he'd laugh, like what I said wasn't even worth considering. And I hated that. I hated it. So I started arguing back. Not just about football, about everything. But it didn't matter. He always had the last word. The room was quiet for a beat, his words hanging between us. Sounds like you grew up believing that if you didn't fight for your opinion, no one else would. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Yeah. I let that settle for a moment. So when Mike called your defender overrated, it wasn't really about the defender at all, was it? Dan's lips parted slightly, but no words came. His fingers loosened, a slow exhale slipping from his chest. Shit, he muttered. It was about me. The realization landed, heavy but clarifying. He ran a hand down his face, like he was wiping away years of tension. I can't believe I almost threw a punch over that, he said, half to himself. Over some stupid old instinct that's been running me for years. I leaned back, letting him process it. It's strange how something so simple, a conversation in a bar, can hold the weight of an entire history. And for a lot of us, anger isn't just about the moment we're in. It's about all the moments before it that taught us what we had to do to be heard, to be seen, to matter. Dan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands, as if trying to physically push away the realization that had just hit him. His breathing had slowed, but I could still see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly, restless. I feel like such an idiot, he muttered. I shook my head. Why? He scoffed. Because I'm a grown man, and I just figured out that I've been acting like a pissed-off teenager every time someone challenges me. It's pathetic. Understanding something doesn't make you pathetic. It makes you aware. And awareness is the only way you change. Dan exhaled through his nose, staring at the floor. Yeah. I guess. But that doesn't change the fact that I've been doing this for years. Every argument, every time I felt like someone was against me, it's all been the same damn thing. And now I have to sit here and admit that I'm no different from my old man. I watched his hands tighten into fists again. You're not your father, Dan. He flinched slightly at the certainty in my voice, as if it was a possibility he hadn't considered. You grew up in a house where you had to fight to be heard. Where backing down meant being dismissed. Of course, you carried that into adulthood. It makes sense. But the fact that you're sitting here, recognizing it, questioning it, that alone proves you're not the same as him. His jaw worked, his throat bobbing with a hard swallow. I swore I wouldn't turn into him. You haven't. A long silence. Then why do I feel like I have? Because patterns feel like chains until you break them. His fingers loosened slightly. You didn't get into that fight, Dan. You made a choice. And that means you already started breaking the pattern. He let out a slow breath, nodding. Yeah. I did, didn't I? I studied him for a moment. But let me ask you something. When you stopped yourself, when you made that decision to pull back instead of lash out, what did that moment feel like? Dan blinked, caught off guard. He looked past me, thinking. It was weird, he admitted. For a split second, I felt like I was letting him win. Like I was just rolling over, being weak. But then. I don't know. I saw the way he was looking at me, like he expected me to keep pushing, and I realized I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be that guy. His fingers tapped lightly against his thigh. And when I reached for my drink instead of my fists, when I laughed instead of doubling down, it felt like relief. I nodded. Because fighting doesn't actually feel good. It just feels familiar. Dan stared at me for a moment, his jaw slackening slightly. Holy shit. I smiled. He let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. I don't think I've ever stopped to question why I react the way I do. I just do it. That's how most of us live, until we start paying attention. His foot tapped against the floor, energy shifting. So if I keep paying attention, if I catch myself in the moment before I explode, before I let it take over, then what? Does it just go away? Not overnight. But you start choosing. And choice is the difference between being controlled by something and learning to control it. Dan ran a hand through his hair, nodding slowly. Yeah. I like that. He met my gaze, something steadier in his expression now. I don't want to be that guy anymore. Good. Because you don't have to be. It's funny how we think certain parts of us are unchangeable, like they're wired in, like we're doomed to be stuck in the same reactions forever. But the truth is, the second we stop running on autopilot, we get a choice. And that choice. It's everything. Dan sat with his elbows on his knees, fingers laced together, staring at the floor like it held the answer to everything. His breathing was steady now, the restless energy in his hands and legs settling into something quieter. So what now? I let the question linger. What do you think? He huffed out a short breath. I think I don't want to be the guy who explodes over nothing anymore. I think I don't want to feel like I have to prove myself in every damn conversation. But I don't know how to just stop. You don't have to stop all at once. You just have to notice. Dan's brow furrowed slightly. Notice what? The feeling before it happens. That split second before you react. What's in your body? What's in your head? His fingers twitched slightly, as if testing the idea. I don't know. I guess, tightness. Heat. Like something rising up in my chest, fast. Good. That's the first sign. What about your thoughts? He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Something like, I have to win this or I can't let this slide. His jaw flexed. Like it's life or death. Except it's not. Exactly. Dan sat back, running a hand down his face. Okay. So let's say I notice it next time. Then what? Just breathe through it. Breathe, sure. But also question it. Ask yourself, why does this feel like an attack? Why does this feel like something I have to fight? His lips pressed together, thoughtful. I never ask myself anything in those moments. I just go straight into defense mode. Which is why it feels automatic. But it's not. You have more control than you think. Dan let that settle for a moment. Then he smirked slightly. You're gonna tell me to meditate, aren't you? I chuckled. Not necessarily. But I am going to tell you to practice pausing. Even just 3 seconds before you respond. Sometimes that's all it takes to shift from reacting to choosing. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. 3 seconds. A lifetime in the middle of an argument. Yeah, he muttered. I bet. He rubbed his palms together, then let them rest on his thighs. You know what's funny? After that night at the bar, Mike texted me. Said he had a great time, that we should catch another game sometime. It made me think, if I had lost it, if I had thrown that punch, none of that would have happened. He would have just been another guy I pissed off, and I would have walked away feeling like crap. I nodded. And now? His shoulders lifted in a small shrug. Now I've got a guy in town who actually wants to grab a beer and watch football with me. A pause. Then a quiet chuckle. Turns out, not fighting feels a whole lot better than fighting. It's wild how many of us walk around carrying reactions we never stop to question. But the second we do, the second we take a breath and ask ourselves, do I really want to respond this way, everything starts to shift. Dan exhaled, rolling his shoulders back like he was shaking off an old weight. His expression was lighter now, not carefree, but clearer, like something had finally clicked into place. So, what happens if I screw up? I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He rubbed his palms together, glancing at me. I mean, let's say I get into another argument. Maybe at work, maybe at a game. And I don't stop myself in time. I blow up. What then? I leaned forward slightly. Then you take responsibility for it. You notice what happened, why it happened, and you learn from it. The goal isn't to be perfect, Dan. It's to get better. His lips pressed together, thoughtful. Yeah. I guess I always saw it as all or nothing. Either I have control, or I don't. It doesn't work like that. No one gets it right all the time. The difference now is that you're aware. And that awareness? That's your reset button. He nodded slowly. Okay. So even if I mess up, it doesn't mean I'm back at square one. Exactly. Every time you catch yourself, even if it's after the fact, you're still moving forward. Dan let out a small laugh, shaking his head. I spent so many years thinking being right was the most important thing. But I can't even count how many times I won an argument and still felt like crap afterward. Maybe winning was never the point. Maybe not. His fingers drummed against his knee, processing. I think about my dad sometimes. About how everything was a fight with him. And I wonder, did he ever feel good about it? Or did he just not know how to be any different? I let the question sit. Maybe both. Dan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah. He sat up straighter, stretching his arms out in front of him before letting them drop to his sides. All right. So, 3-second pauses, questioning my reactions, and remembering that not everything is a battle. That about cover it? I smiled. It's a good start. Dan smirked, shaking his head. Man. Who knew a football debate would turn into a full-on therapy session? Sometimes the smallest moments show us the biggest things. He exhaled, then gave a small nod, as if setting something in place. All right. Let's see if I can keep myself from trying to win every conversation from now on. He stood, rolling his shoulders back once more. Appreciate this, Doc. Really. I watched as he walked toward the door, lighter than when he first stepped in. Growth doesn't happen in an instant. It happens in small choices, over and over, until one day, you realize you're not the same person you used to be. Have you ever caught yourself in the middle of an old habit and decided to try something new? What happened? Drop a comment. Let's share some stories.